Will the impending marriage of megastar Taylor Swift and her NFL fiance Travis Kelce produce a contagion effect in favor of marriage and family? I'm joined today by Cardus president Brian Dijkema to answer precisely that question. Brian, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Always a pleasure.
You and your colleagues at Cardus think and write a lot about marriage and family as key institutions of stability and support and love. There's a lot of evidence, though, that these institutions aren't doing that well these days. And so a lot of people have been asking themselves the question, what can we do to bolster them? For those of us who've been looking at culture and policy, were we looking in the wrong place, Brian? Can Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce actually be the catalyst?
Oh, heck yeah. I think that's the secret sauce. I mean, a lot of people will point to, and this is typical for policy discussion, Sean, and you are in this all the time. A lot of people point to economic incentives and other things
Yes.
like that. But at the end of the day, it's culture all the way down. And it's a lot of questions around, what is the nature of marriage? What's the nature of a good and successful life? And I think what's fascinating is, and by the way, I should just stop and say, congratulations to Travis and Taylor. I hope they have. I look forward to them getting married. I hope till death do them part. And
Mhm.
I wish them the best. Like it's kind of a great thing. Like who's going to get mad at a couple that seems to be happily in love going to get married? Like go for it, guys. I'm very happy for you. I don't know you from Adam, um, but good job. I love to see it. So let me just start by saying that. Um,
Please.
but also say like in some ways they're the big stars, right? But in many ways they do represent sort of the typical approach to marriage these days. Like if you follow Cardus's work, or in the States there's a group called the Institute for Family Studies, you'll notice that marriage has sort of shifted later in life, and it's true in Canada right now. I think the mean age for your first marriage is around 31 years old. I think that Travis and Taylor are 35 or somewhere in their mid 30s. So they kind of represent, continuity with the norm there. And that represents a sort of view of marriage that's seen as a capstone. And they represent that too, right? Taylor Swift is perhaps the most successful musician alive today. So successful that, people in the music industry think that she could take on Spotify and, actually create a new structure for musicians that's not subscription based, but that cares about music. People like Ted Gioia have thought that she's a big deal. So she's been very
Yes.
successful. And obviously Kelsey has been very successful. He's got what, a couple of Super Bowls under his belt, a Pro Bowl guy all the time, probably one of the best players to have changed his position in terms of what people are looking for. And so the fact that they're sort of doing this, and of course they're financially doing pretty well for themselves. And so in many ways, their engagement and their marriage represents what is normal in North America right now. There's some other stuff too that I'll get into, but I think there's something fascinating about the way in which they got engaged.
Yeah, we'll come to your point about capstone because that point has been made by those who have raised doubts about the potential cultural significance of their engagement, that this is more about affirming the dominant paradigm rather than challenging. But before we get there, let's just address this directly on behalf of our listeners and viewers. This isn't just a manufactured reason to talk about the biggest story in the news this week. Many are indeed talking about the extent to which their relationship and pending marriage has a potential transmission effect. Melissa Kearney, an economist who's written extensively about marriage and family and whom we've spoken to on Hub Dialogues, posted the following on X, quote, "I'm eager to see what effect this has on their fan base since role models and celebrities affect attitudes, aspirations, and behaviors. This, as Brian just set out, is an engagement of cultural significance," unquote. Why don't you just talk a bit, Brian, about those potential transmission effects to the broader culture and people?
For sure. And I'll start, Sean, by noting that a lot of people have, looked at stats of the decline of marriage, and there certainly is, fewer. There are fewer marriages today than there were in the 70s. Certainly fewer than there were in the 40s. And so people sort of say marriage is on the decline, and marriage is sort of no one wants to get married anymore. But that's not actually true. Today, like I think marriage relationship is the dominant relationship structure in Canada and in North America still. I think they represent about 77% of relationships in Canada as of 2021. So that's still a vast majority of people are married, and a vast majority of people want to get married. And so,
Mm.
there's, I think something like Pew did some research in the States, and I think it was 69% of people aged 18 to 24 want to get married. And so, there's certainly a desire to get married there. And I think what you're often looking for is that thing going to be seen as something culturally, going to give you status in culture? And as much as we like to think we're rational creatures, and we do often act according to incentives and so on, in this sense, the incentives are often social, right? And if it's seen as
Mm.
being like, if a young person gets married at 21, and I got married quite early, you have to deal with a lot of, oh, are you sure you want to do that? Are you sure you want to end, your life? Or isn't that gonna like sort of limit your freedom? Is that going to limit your career aspects, particularly when it comes to women? The thought that like getting married is the end of a career. And so there's this question of social esteem and social pressure, and it's real.
Mm.
I mean, anybody who says they're not affected by that is probably lying to you. And so the reverse, of course, also happens when high status people, and you can't think of anybody higher than Swift and Kelce, at least into popular imagination. When they get married, when they make a move like that to affirm something, what it does is introduce the normalization of that behavior, and that's another thing to note. Like I think Ross Douthat in the New York Times had mentioned this, that the sort of like this, if there was some sort of like pro-family mole, like sort of long con to try to get people to do it, they couldn't have planted better people than Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. There's a sort of certain gendered element to it, right? Kelce's a big, huge
The
dude
jock.
who plays the jock who
Yes.
plays football, right? And she's
Yes.
this sweet, thoughtful, beautiful musician. Like,
Well, let me take
yeah,
that up because I was going to read incidentally a quote from precisely that column. And this makes the case in a way that you're making that this is likely to have or may have some positive effect. Ross Douthat, who we frequently mention here at the Hub, writes the following quote: "It's normal and wholesome and mainstream in an explicitly conservative coded way. A story where the famous pop star abandons her country roots and spends years dating unsuccessfully in a pool of Hollywood creeps and angsty musicians, only to find true love in the arms of a bearded Heartland football star who runs a goofy podcast with his equally bearded, happily married, easily inebriated older brother. I mean, this is a Hallmark Christmas movie. This is an allegory of conservative Americana. This is a right-wing meme," unquote. So talk a bit about Douthat's line of argument and why you're inclined to agree with it.
yeah. I mean, I mean, it has become a right wing meme because that's what has been coded into our cultural conversations. We've gotten so used to certain segments of our political discussion normalizing or saying that marriage is not normal. It's you've got all this stuff about heteronormativity and the sort of dominant modes of marriage and stuff like that. But as we've seen, like, and this is a conservative thing, the people on the ground haven't really followed that. Despite all of this stuff around sexuality and identity and so on, you still see the majority of people are married, want to get married, and there's this sort of sense of that. And I think that the fact that you've got Kelce and Swift, who are by extent normal people who
Yes.
seem to like, despite all of the crazy fame, right? Like this is the thing, you can have crazy fame and go the Harry Styles, one of the former lovers of Kelce, go this sort of route of like self-absorption and so on. But they seem to be pretty normal people that you could
Yes.
go grab a beer with or go have a good night out with and have a good time without being the James Dobsons of the world, that many people see as the boogaboo, or the sort of the boogeyman of this. And James Dobson, I think, sort of focus on the family type guy. He passed away recently, and many people
Yes.
were saying, "Oh, he did incalculable harm to many people." I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, but the point is, you have normal people doing the normal thing that most people want to do, which is to get married, and they're not weird. It's just a perfectly normal thing. And we know from statistics that divorce, for instance, is contagious. That if you're in a friend group and somebody in that friend group, one couple divorces, that it's much more likely for others in that friend group to divorce. And the same thing you can imagine is true, and I believe it is true statistically in the reverse, that people get married, you've got friends, you're showing up at weddings, and the showing up at a wedding is like, oh, this could be really, really good. The other thing to note, Sean, is sort of the sort of absence of role models, or at least the sort of putting out of role models. There's been a generation that experienced a great a high level of divorce in the 80s and 90s that slowed down actually quite a bit now. Married couples that get married now actually stay married. Divorce rates are on the decline, not just because marriage is not there, but the people who get married tend to stay there for a long time. And you'd see the depictions of good marriages and bad marriages in popular culture. If you want to go full on, cultural, anybody who's watched Friday Night Lights, which is a great TV show, not the movie kind of sucked in my opinion, but Friday Night Lights, Coach Taylor, that marriage is a beautiful thing. It's real. They fight. They have scraps. They have this tensions with one another, but they make it work. And it seems to be the case with Kelce and Swift the same way. There's after they won the Super Bowl, big smooch. Love that moment. He's like, look, I'm gonna go party with the boys for a bit. And it just seems normal, right? And there's something about that's like we don't have to justify something that's good. Sometimes it's just good to do something that's good. And I think that's really great. And I think so. My hope is, I'm not predicting, but I think there is probably going to be something related to a pro-marriage contagion, but it's going to look a little different than you might expect. And one hopes, and this is where I go full full grandma here and say, one hopes, Sean, that the Swift Kelce union will result in all kinds of beautiful emo babies, and I really hope that for them. I really do hope that their love, ends and produces beautiful little creatures that go on to, either make good music or work at McDonald's. Who cares? But
Yes.
There's something about that, and we know, like, we can talk maybe a little bit about that. There's definitely the evidence for how, sort of social or traditional or cultural markers drive behavior. That's certainly true. There's a really cool study that I could share with you, but that's my hope. That's my hope for Travis.
Before we get there, I just want to contest your enthusiasm a little bit, and it speaks to the point you made earlier. Patrick T. Brown, a family and marriage scholar, someone I think with some adjacency to Cardus, published in Compact magazine in the past day or so some skepticism over the contagion hypothesis. He writes, as you alluded earlier, quote, Swift is modeling, not challenging, the idea that marriage is a capstone on young adulthood that comes after career success has been achieved. Far from encouraging early family formation, she is following the dominant cultural paradigm, unquote. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say empirically that's absolutely true. And I think I've pointed that out a little bit, right?
Yes.
I think they're both 35. They both made a ton of money. They're both successful, sort of peak career. And it does model that. But nonetheless, they could have done something else, right? They could have done what many people in Hollywood do, is they sort of live together. They could, have sort of open relationships or whatever, but they still made the choice to get married. And so I agree with Patrick, and I share his skepticism about this being a sort of major game changer in marriage rates or what have you. But at the end of the day, I'm still, as I said at the beginning, I'm still happy for a couple of people who seem to love one another and who've made the decision to get married. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what type of vows they'll take. And of course, that's a difference too, that, traditional vows and traditional relationships of sort of mutual self-sacrifice and lifelong commitment are not always the norm, even in marriages in the way that they're described. But I still think we should be celebrating and encouraging and just being happy for people who are making that call and making that move. And particularly when it seems that they're quite happy there, right? And I think that's one thing to note. It's like, there's often this assumption that conservatives, and particularly religious conservatives, just want people to get married and stay in there, and if you're miserable or what have you, it's not actually aligned with reality. And I think what's fascinating is that, if you look at statistics on happiness or satisfaction when it comes to either sexual satisfaction or life satisfaction, that those who are like in these committed relationships that are quite egalitarian in their practice, if not necessarily in their description, tend to be quite happy. And I don't know. Again, I don't know the Swift Kelce's at all,
You
but
mentioned just in that vein, Brian. You mentioned work by the Institute for Family Studies in the U.S. They published research just in the past couple of days that shows among women, those who report the highest levels of happiness are married moms, which is
yeah,
a huge challenge to a lot of ways in which motherhood, of course, is presented in the popular culture.
yeah, that's exactly right. And it's because kids are awesome. And it's one of those things that and our data have shown that like women want children. We've done that study that I think we talked about, or you've talked with
Yes.
Andrea or Peter John, our family program colleagues. You know, people want children. Just like the data seem to suggest that people also want to get married. There is this vision of, Brad Wilcox, who's the head of the IFS, talks about marriage as being a place where there's a sort of union of economics, emotional support, and sexual union. There's this, it's a holistic picture, and there's a certain stability and vulnerability matched with safety in that. It's sort of like it's an extremely risky thing, but if it's done well, it's also the most whole thing. And plenty of examples of where it's gone bad, both in the past and present. And it's again, people are saying, "Oh, you religious conservatives are always talking about this, and you're not paying attention to cases of abuse." No one is in favor of that.
Sure.
But when it's done well, and we need models to show how it's done well, it can be good for men and women. And of course, it produces children, which are beautiful things that if you have them, you love them. And it's one of those, I could go on for a while about that, but I'm losing when my boys are going off to university this year. So I'm in this sort of very pensive mode about children. So anyway.
Well, this is your point about getting married and starting a family earlier. We're roughly the same age. Your boys are going off to university, and my oldest is going off to junior kindergarten. So there are big trade-offs on both sides. Let's just wrap up with a question about some analysis we produced at the Hub this week from a regular contributor named Matt Spoke, which documented the declining percentage of 30-year-olds by decade who are married and own a home.
Mhm.
In roughly 1950, 1960, it was north of a majority who in their 30s were married and have a home. Today, it is barely 10%. So we've been talking a lot about culture. I know that it is core to Cardus's understanding of these issues, that culture plays a key, perhaps dominant role in shaping these types of outcomes. But talk a bit about the role of public policy.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's certainly a role for public policy to play, and not just public policy on marriage, right? But also public policy on things like housing.
Yes.
Our senior fellow Lyman Stone, who does work on fertility and demographics, has shown, for instance, that if you're worried about fertility, you should be worried about housing because
Yeah.
married couples that live with their parents actually have lower fertility, which I can understand why. There's a, I'll leave the dot 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 for the
Imagination.
listeners to
Yes.
imagine. But there's a sense in which if you don't have your own place, there's of course that sort of awkwardness, but there's also the are we starting our own life together?
Yes.
And it's a
You're kind of
very
you're
real,
stuck in this sense
yeah,
of
yeah.
transition.
I'm still a kid in my parents' basement, and I want to have kids, and we want to start our own life. There is a sense, even while you may have that sort of more extended vision of the nuclear family of not just these sort of mom, dad plus their immediate children, but a broader one, including aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. There is still something about a couple starting a new life together away from their parents. And if you're in a situation where there's a policy environment where some of the things that facilitate that sort of departure and sort of starting of a new life, like housing, you are going to see effects on marriage rates and on children. I will say there are things you can do contrary to that. that encourages children. In fact, in many ways, Canada, what I find fascinating when we talk to our American friends on the family issue, they are looking for all kinds of stuff like mat leaves and child benefits. Canada has all that stuff. So in many ways, on the like fertility and formation stuff, the Canadian situation policy environment is actually much more conducive to it, and yet
Favorable.
we still have run
Yes.
into it. The housing one is a real one. But I also think there is in Canada that the cultural one, just looping back to that, Sean, is important, and particularly for family formation of children. And there's a
Mhm.
real cool study that our senior fellow Lyman Stone has brought up multiple times, which is that in Georgia, the country just south of Russia, Georgia is an Eastern Orthodox country. A lot of Christians there who are associated with the Orthodox Church. And the Georgian Patriarch, which is the sort of for Catholics, it's the bishop, and for others who are not religious at all, it's sort of one of the hierarchy figures in the hierarchy in the Orthodox Church in Georgia. He said, "Look, I will personally baptize your third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh child. I will do it. I will come and I will baptize your child." And he sort of put that out there, right? And what we saw was 17% increase in the national fertility rate. There's a beautiful paper on this. A 42% increase in the birth rate within marriage within Orthodox women. So just a massive increase. And what I think that shows is, and there's also a decline of all kinds of other negative things. And it shows that like actually cultural signals really, really matter. And Canada is not an Orthodox country and certainly not a Georgian Orthodox country, but in a North American culture that's looking for authority figures, people that look up to, the Kelce-Swift union is a beautiful one and maybe even a hopeful one. I think I'm with Patrick on it. We may not see the marriage effect, but if they have a couple of kids, that's where you might see the effect. And who knows? Who knows, Sean? I'm prognosticating, but the stats seem to say it might be possible.
That was a brilliant landing of the plane. I didn't quite know how we were going to get there, but we did. Uh, Brian Dijkema, the president of Cardus Canada, will have you back on for wedding day commentary. But until then,
Here
thank
for
you
it.
so much for joining us for this episode of Hub Hits, and thank you to our listeners and viewers. Please subscribe on the Hub's podcast channels, and of course our YouTube channel. We welcome your comments and feedback, and of course, grateful for you listening and watching our content each day. We'll be back with you tomorrow for another episode of Hub Hits. Bye bye.